The ice was the first strange thing. Ray Calloway noticed it when he set his water cup on the counter and heard a soft crack. A thin, perfect layer of frost had formed across the top. He stared at it. The station's heating unit had been unreliable for weeks, but this was something else. This was cold that came from somewhere specific. From inside the apartment. Ray filed a maintenance request, because even when something was clearly wrong, the correct thing to do was file the form. And then he sat down and ate his noodles. He was tired in the way that only a double shift in the maintenance bay could make a person tired. Tired in the bones. Tired behind the eyes. He turned off the lights and went to bed. He was almost asleep when he heard it. Breathing. Not the sound of pipes settling. Not the hum of recycled air through old vents. Breathing. Slow and careful. Like something that was trying very hard not to make a sound and not quite succeeding. Ray went still. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. The breathing was coming from below him. From under the bed. He thought about what was reasonable. He thought about what was not reasonable. Then, very slowly, he leaned over the edge of the mattress and looked down into the dark. Two eyes looked back. They were amber-colored, pale gold around the edges, cracked with darker lines in the middle, like old glass with light coming through it. They were set in a face that was long and narrow and covered in small scales the color of a forest scene from far away, green-gold, shifting even in the dim light. The creature was small. Small enough to curl up in the space under a standard issue station bed. Its sides were moving fast, too fast, the way something breathes when it is terrified and trying not to show it. Ray looked at it. It looked at Ray. Then it whispered. The voice was quiet and careful, and it spoke in standard Galactic with an accent Ray did not recognize, the words shaped like they had been learned from records rather than from people. Please don't let them find me. Ray did not move for a long moment. He noticed the scales, pale now, almost white, the gold drained out of them like color bleeding from fabric. He noticed the way the small body was pressed against the far wall, as far from him as the space would allow. He noticed the faint, mineral smell, like warm stone after rain. He did not call station security. He did not reach for his comm. What he said, very quietly, was, "Are you hurt?" The eyes blinked. Once. Slowly. As if that question was not the one that had been expected. "No," the creature whispered. No, I am not hurt." "Okay," Ray said. He pulled himself back up and sat on the edge of the bed. He rubbed his face with both hands. Then he stood up, went to the kitchen, and filled a bowl with warm water from the tap. He came back and set it carefully on the floor near the edge of the bed, within reach of the space underneath, and stepped back. "I don't know if you drink water," he said, "but it's there if you do." There was a long silence. Then, so carefully it barely made a sound, a small scaled nose appeared at the edge of the dark. It sniffed the air above the bowl. The tip of it was a slightly brighter gold than the rest of the face. "You are not afraid," the creature said. It sounded confused by this. "I'm a little afraid," Ray said honestly. "But you're clearly more afraid than I am." So, he sat back down on the bed and looked at the floor. "My name is Ray," he said. "I'm a maintenance technician. I've lived here for 3 years, and nothing interesting has ever happened to me. So I'm going to need you to explain some things. But not right now. Right now it's 2 in the morning, and I'm exhausted." He paused. "You can stay under there tonight. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Another silence. Longer this time. "My name is Sorrel," the voice said at last. It was so quiet Ray almost didn't catch it. "Okay, Sorrel," Ray said. He lay back down, pulled the blanket up, stared at the ceiling. "The bowl is there if you want it." He was nearly asleep again when there was a soft sound below him. A very small sound, like a tiny exhale of warm breath. And then, faintly, the smell of something that had burned, not unpleasant, more like a struck match, and Ray realized, distantly, that the dust had probably caught for just a second. Just a small flame, gone in an instant. Ray did not open his eyes. "Please," he said, "do not set my apartment on fire." A pause below. "I am," said the small voice, "very sorry." Ray smiled at the ceiling in the dark. Outside, Helix Station hummed the way it always did. Far away, in the sector's shipping lanes, a Dominion retrieval ship was still searching. It did not know, yet, where to look. Under Ray's bed, Sorrel's scale slowly shifted from white back to pale gold. It was the first time in 3 weeks that the trembling stopped. The message arrived on a Tuesday. It came through official Dominion channels, which meant it carried a priority flag that turned every screen on Helix Station a pale, official blue. Station Administrator Dov read it twice in his office with the door closed, then read it a third time, and then poured himself a glass of water and sat very still for several minutes. The message was polite. Dominion messages were always polite. They were polite the way a pressure seal was polite. Perfectly calm, completely firm, and capable of catastrophic consequences if ignored. It stated, a Spark-class asset, designation 7 Gamma Sorrel, had escaped Dominion custody during a routine transfer and was believed to be in the sector. All stations under Dominion Treaty were required to report any sighting of unusual non-registered creatures immediately. Failure to report carried penalties including, and here Dov's eyes moved slowly over the words, station review, quarantine, and potential decommissioning. Dov broadcast the notice system-wide and went to find antacids. Ray read the message on a terminal in the maintenance bay. He read it once. He read it again. He closed the terminal screen. He thought about the creature behind his water heater, because Sorrel had moved in the night, sometime before morning, and that was where Ray found the small curled shape when he woke up, tucked against the warm metal of the unit, scales perfectly matched to its color so that Ray had almost reached past without noticing. He thought about the bowl of water, which had been half emptied. He thought about the way Sorrel had looked at him when Ray came home the night before and simply said, without preamble, I brought mineral supplements from the med bay. I don't know what kind. I guessed. Sorrel had been so surprised by this that the scales went briefly, brilliantly orange. Ray did not report anything. He finished his shift and went home. In the days that followed, a strange quiet routine took shape. Sorrel was fascinated by everything. Not in the loud, excitable way. In the careful, intense way of someone who had been kept away from things for a long time and was now absorbing them with total concentration. Ray gave Sorrel access to a spare datapad and the station archive, and Sorrel read for hours without moving, the amber eyes tracking steadily across the screen. On the third day, Sorrel looked up from the datapad and said, You invented the concept of the weekend. Ray, eating noodles at the counter, looked over. Yeah. Voluntarily. You made a rule that said, we will not work. For rest. That's more or less it. No other species has done this. Not by popular agreement. The Carapace have mandatory rest cycles, but those are medically enforced. You did it because you decided you wanted to. Sorrel set the datapad down. This is the most radical thing I have found in the archive so far. Ray stared at Sorrel for a moment. You've been in there for 14 hours, and the most radical thing is the weekend? Yes, Sorrel said, completely seriously. Ray decided not to argue with that. He asked, carefully, what dragons were supposed to be. Not what the Dominion used them for. What they were supposed to be. Sorrel was quiet for a while. Memory keepers, Sorrel said at last. In the old records. Before the Dominion classified us. We held history. We remembered everything told to us. Every voice, every word, every story given to us for safekeeping. We traveled between civilizations and carried knowledge across distances too great for any single generation to cross. A pause. The Dominion decided that a creature capable of perfect memory and precise fire was more useful as a weapon. The water heater hummed between them. That's awful, Ray said. Yes, Sorrel said. Most things the Dominion does are. The inspector arrived on a Thursday. His name was Reth. He was Carapace, tall, with the smooth, dark shell his species developed as they aged, and the careful, unhurried movements of someone who had done this particular job for a long time. He was not cruel. Ray got that sense immediately. Reth was simply efficient, the way a well-maintained machine was efficient. He was here to find the asset. He did not enjoy it or dislike it. He just did it. He went door to door through the station's residential corridor. Ray heard him coming and had 20 seconds to warn Sorrel. Ray knocked twice on the water heater casing, their agreed signal, and heard the faint sound of scales shifting against metal as Sorrel went completely still. Reth knocked. Ray opened the door. The questions were standard. Had Ray seen anything unusual? Any unfamiliar smells, sounds, heat signatures? Any non-registered life forms? Ray said no to all of them, and he was not a good liar, and he knew it, and Reth's flat dark eyes were watching him with the attention of something that did not miss details. Then, from behind the wall, from the general area of the water heater, came a sound. A voice. Two voices. Then ambient sound. The precise, layered audio of a nature documentary, mid-episode, complete with the measured tones of a narrator explaining something about oceanic ecosystems. It sounded exactly like a screen playing in the next room. Retha's eyes moved briefly toward the sound, then back to Ray. Documentary, Ray said. His voice was even. He was very proud of this. Reth made a note. Thanked Ray. Left. Ray closed the door. He stood with his back against it. His heart was doing something very fast and unpleasant in his chest. From behind the wall, the documentary sounds faded. Was that, Ray said, very carefully, you doing voice impressions of an entire nature documentary? Sorrel emerged from behind the water heater. The scales were very pale. Dragons remember everything we hear, Sorrel said. Every voice, every sound, every story ever told to us. I had heard that specific program from 3 apartments down, twice. Ray looked at Sorrel for a long moment. Sorrel, he said, that is genuinely incredible. Sorrel's scales shifted, uncertain, something like embarrassed. The Dominion prefers we use it to repeat targeting coordinates. The station was quiet around them. Reth filed his report that evening. No confirmed sighting. Search expanding to adjacent sectors. They had bought time. Neither of them said how little of it there probably was. Petra had known since day 2. She lived in the unit across the corridor, a retired cargo hauler, 61 years old, with knuckles that had been broken and re-healed so many times they no longer quite straightened, and eyes that had spent 3 decades watching asteroid fields for rocks that were trying to kill her. Those eyes did not miss things. They did not miss the faint scorch mark on the corridor floor outside Ray's door. They did not miss the way Ray had started carrying an extra bag from the station's mineral recycling exchange. They did not miss the sound, very late one night, of a voice speaking in a language that was not standard galactic, coming through the shared wall, not quite human, not quite anything Petra had heard before, but curious and young-sounding. Petra had done the math. She started leaving things outside Ray's door. A chunk of iron dense or small enough to look accidental. A piece of raw copper from a broken fitting she had no use for. She did not knock. She did not leave a note. On the 5th day, Ray opened his door, looked at the ore on the floor, looked at Petra's door across the corridor, and knocked. Petra opened it. Ray said, "You don't know what you think you know." Petra said, "Tell that to the scorch mark on the floor." Ray stood in the doorway for a moment. "Copper," Sorrel had told him 2 nights before, in a tone of pure reverence. "Tastes like starlight." Ray had not been sure how to process that, but had filed it away as important. He said, "It likes copper." Petra said, "I know. I left some." That was the whole conversation. Petra went back inside. Ray went back inside. The copper disappeared from the corridor by morning. In the following days, the circle grew, not because anyone was careless, but because Helix Station was small, and because people noticed things, and because once noticed, Sorrel was very difficult to think of as a piece of military hardware. Deshi was 15 and worked afternoons in his parents' mineral recycling shop 2 levels down. He found out because he came by to drop off a delivery for Ray and heard the datapad on the counter reading aloud from a galactic history text, and then heard a second voice asking what democratic election meant, and then heard Ray attempting to explain voting in a way that made it sound both noble and faintly absurd. Deshi stood in the doorway for 4 seconds, then said, "Is that a dragon?" Ray said no. Deshi looked at Sorrel directly. Sorrel's scales went pale orange. Deshi said, "Cool," and came inside and sat down. He and Sorrel spent an afternoon playing strategy games on the datapad. Sorrel lost every single round. This delighted Sorrel completely. Not because losing was pleasant, but because the concept of a game that was specifically designed so that someone had to lose, for no reason except the structure of the game itself, was apparently the second most radical thing Sorrel had encountered in human culture. Yolanda was the station medic. She found out through Deshi, swore quietly in 2 languages, and then showed up at Ray's door with a medical kit and a look on her face that meant she had already decided what she was going to do. She examined Sorrel in the careful, professional way of someone who was going to be thorough regardless of whether what she was examining was in her training. She found the scarring along Sorrel's spine without commenting on it. Old marks, in patterns that were clearly not natural. Too regular, too deliberate. Pre-bonding restraint marks. Ray understood, though he did not know that word yet. Yolanda packed her kit away when she was done. She sat on the edge of Ray's couch and looked at Sorrel for a moment. "You're going to be fine," she said. She said it the way she said it to Patience, not as comfort, but as fact, as a thing she was personally going to make sure of. Sorrel's scales went very still, then slowly shifted to the warm gold color Ray had started to understand meant something like safety. Ness ran station security. Ness found out by figuring it out independently, filing nothing, and beginning to run what the schedule listed as routine maintenance corridor checks, at times that happened to create convenient gaps in Inspector Retha's patrol patterns. Ness did not discuss this with anyone. Ness simply did it. None of them talked about why they were doing it in those terms. No one made a speech about it. Petra left, or on the floor. Deshi brought copper shavings in a folded piece of cloth. Yolanda made sure Sorrel's spine would heal correctly. Ness made gaps in patrol routes. Ray came home every evening and sat on the floor next to the water heater and talked with Sorrel about whatever Sorrel had been reading that day, which was always something and always interesting. Then came the Thursday that Reth knocked on Ray's door for the second time. This time Reth had a scanner. It was a small device, flat and dark, and it read heat signatures through walls. Reth held it at his side, as if it were nothing particular. Ray felt the cold drop in his stomach, but kept his face neutral. He answered the door. He answered Retha's questions again. Same answers, even voice. Behind the wall, there was no sound at all. Then Reth lifted the scanner and pointed it in the direction of the water heater. The device read, "Thermal anomaly. Consistent with faulty heating unit." Not a life sign, just a bad appliance. What Reth did not know was that Ness had spent the previous evening walking Ray through how to reroute a heat signature through a station system, so it read as mechanical rather than biological. What Reth did not know was that it had taken Ray 4 tries and 1 near electrocution. Petra's, who was fine and furious about it, to get the rerouting right. Reth made a note. Left again. Ray closed the door, leaned on it, let out a breath that had been waiting for several minutes. Sorrel came out from behind the wall. The amber eyes were very bright. "More ships are coming," Sorrel said quietly. "I heard it in the transmission frequencies this morning. 2 retrieval vessels. And after them," a pause, "after them is a different class of ship." Ray looked at the floor. "Then we need a better plan," Ray said. "Not just hiding." Sorrel watched him. "You have something in mind," Sorrel said. It was not quite a question. "I work in maintenance," Ray said slowly. "I know every system on this station. Every sensor, every conduit, every blind spot." He looked up. "I think I know how to make you invisible." Outside, the stars were the same as always. But somewhere in the sector, the sensor sweeps were getting closer. Tomorrow was going to require a very long list. The announcement came from a ship that had no interest in being polite about it. Commander Sulith of the Dominion Retrieval Authority broadcast directly to Helix Station's general channel, bypassing Administrator Dov entirely, which was the first thing that told Ray this was different from Reth. Reth had been efficient. Sulith was something else. A large Varek, built like a creature that had evolved specifically to make other things feel small, and speaking in the flat, total certainty of someone who had never once been told no by anything that mattered. The station had 48 hours to surrender the asset. After that, the retrieval operation would move to the next phase. Sulith did not explain what the next phase was. The implication was sufficient. Ray sat in the maintenance bay after the broadcast ended and wrote a list. He had always written lists. When the secondary coolant system on level 4 started failing, he wrote a list. When 3 airlocks needed recalibration simultaneously during a shift shortage, he wrote a list. A list meant the problem had a shape. A shape meant the problem could be worked. He wrote heat signature, bioscanners, voice frequency detection, movement sensors, electromagnetic interference. Then he wrote, next to each one, what he knew about it. And he knew a lot, because he had spent 6 years maintaining every system on Helix Station, and he knew exactly where each one was unreliable, exactly where each one had gaps, and exactly what the station's mineral processing core did to scanner equipment that got too close. He called a meeting in the maintenance bay. Ray, Petra, Deshi's parents, who had found out the previous week and responded with the calm practicality of people who had built a business by solving problems with limited resources, Yolanda, Ness, and 2 other residents who were part of the circle now. He spread his notes on the workbench and started talking. The plan was not dramatic. It was cable splicing and frequency work and careful timing. And it was the kind of plan that only worked if everyone did their piece correctly and no one panicked. Ray walked through each part. People asked questions. He answered them. Someone suggested a modification to the heat routing that was actually better than Ray's original approach, and Ray crossed out his version and wrote the new one. Petra got electrocuted during the test run. Not seriously, a sharp shock from a junction that still had current running through it when it shouldn't have. She sat back, shook her hand out, looked at Ray, and said, "The junction on the south conduit is still live," and then picked up the tool again. Sorrel watched all of this from the corner of the maintenance bay, where Ray had quietly moved the operation. Sorrel was very still, which Ray had learned meant Sorrel was paying attention to everything at once. When the others left to run their pieces of the plan, Ray found Sorrel watching him with an expression he didn't have a word for yet. "What?" Ray said. "In the old records," Sorrel said, "the ones from before the Dominion, there are accounts of dragons living among other species. Not as weapons, as companions, as partners." A pause. "I always believed those records were mythology." "Why?" "Because the universe I know does not work that way. In the universe I know, a species looks at what I am, at what I can do, and decides how to use it." Sorrel's scales were very still, holding a deep, steady gold. No species takes that kind of risk for something the Dominion has told them is not worth the trouble. Ray thought about Petra's burned hand, about Yolanda's careful examination, about Ness quietly building gaps into patrol schedules, alone, without telling anyone. He didn't say anything. He went back to his list. Sulith boarded Helix Station the next morning with 4 members of a security detail, all of them Varek, all of them in the light armor the retrieval division favored. Sulith moved through the station's main corridor as if the place had already been assessed and found beneath consideration. The residents who happened to be in the corridor moved aside. Most of them looked at the floor. Sulith stopped in the main concourse and addressed the gathered residents in the particular tone of someone who did not expect to repeat themselves. "You are concealing Dominion property. The penalty for this is not abstract. You have until this evening." There was a silence. Then Petra, who had both hands in the pockets of her work jacket and a fresh bandage on one knuckle, said pleasantly, "We're not concealing anything. We're a working station. You're welcome to search wherever you like." A pause. "We do recommend standard hazard protocols in the mineral processing core. It gets quite warm in there, and the electromagnetic interference plays havoc with most modern equipment." Sulith looked at Petra. Petra looked back with the expression of someone who had watched asteroid fields for 30 years and found a Dominion commander considerably less alarming. Sulith searched. The detail went through every corridor, every storage bay, every residential unit. The bioscanners read Sorrel's location as a malfunction in the station's heating grid, because Ray had spent 2 evenings rerouting the thermal signature through 3 different conduit junctions. The voice frequency scanners picked up nothing in the processing core because the electromagnetic noise from the mineral extraction units drowned out everything within 20 meters, which was where Sorrel was, sitting very still on the warm floor of the core, listening to the searchers move through the station above. Sulith found nothing. Sulith was not used to finding nothing. That evening, Sulith transmitted a new message to station administration. The search was being escalated. Warships, not retrieval vessels, warships, had been authorized for the sector. Ray told Sorrel. They were in the processing core together. It was loud and hot and smelled like melted ore, and it was the safest place on the station. Sorrel said quietly, "Ray, they will destroy this station to retrieve me. I should give myself up." "No." "Ray." "No." Ray sat down on the floor next to Sorrel. The warmth from the processing units pressed in from all sides. "We're not done figuring it out." Sorrel looked at him for a long moment. The amber eyes were steady. The scales were pale, but not white, not the frightened white of that first night under the bed. "You are very small," Sorrel said, "for the amount of trouble you cause." "Yeah," Ray said. "I've heard that." The warships were 6 hours out. Ray's list had a new section at the bottom. He had been staring at it for an hour. It was shorter than the others, and he did not like what it meant, but he wrote it down anyway, because a problem with a shape could be worked, and this problem still had a shape. He just needed more time. He did not yet know that time was coming from a direction he had not thought to look. The story leaked because of Deshi, a small station, a dragon in hiding, a maintenance technician who said yes when a frightened creature whispered in the dark. The Dominion moved to suppress it. The suppression worked on maybe a third of the channels. The other two-thirds had already copied the fragments somewhere else. Most Dominion species ignored it or sided with official policy. The law was the law, assets were assets, and humans were a minor species without political standing. Several Dominion member councils issued statements expressing full support for the retrieval operation and quiet irritation that it was taking so long. But not everyone. The Terati were an old species. Long-lived, careful, known across the galaxy for their legal scholarship and their habit of saying things in precise language that other species found inconvenient. A Terati legal council published a single public document, not a protest, just an observation, noting that the Dominion's classification of Spark-class dragons as property rather than persons had never been formally adjudicated. It had been assumed at the time of classification and written into treaty as assumption. The document asked, academically and without apparent urgency, whether an unadjudicated classification could form the legal basis for a retrieval operation. The Dominion's legal division responded within 6 hours that the classification was settled. The Terati Council noted, politely, that settled and adjudicated were different words. The exchange was quiet and technical, and most species found it difficult to follow. But it was there, in the public record, and people who understood these things understood that the Terati did not make observations by accident. The second development came from much farther away, in a distant star system that appeared on Dominion charts as uninhabited, and was, in fact, deliberately and carefully uninhabited by any species except the ones who had chosen it as a place to be left alone. A group of older dragons had been listening to the Infonet for 2 centuries. They did not speak to the Dominion. They had not spoken to the Dominion since a conversation 200 years ago that had ended in a way none of them had forgotten. They composed a transmission. It was addressed to Helix Station, to all Dominion vessels in the sector, and, in the move that caused 3 Dominion senior officials to read it twice and then call their legal teams, to every member species council simultaneously. The transmission was not a threat. Old dragons did not make threats in the way younger species meant the word. It was a statement, composed in the careful, ancient legal dialect that the Dominion's own founding documents had been written in, because the old dragons had been there when those documents were written and had memorized every word of every session. It stated, "We are watching. We recognize Sorrel, designation 7 Gamma, as a person of dragon kind. We invoke the Founding Compact, Article 7, which states that no being recognized as sentient by a member species or allied observer may be held as property under Dominion law." The Dominion's legal team responded that dragons had never been ratified as sentient beings under the compact. The old dragons responded, within minutes. "We were present at the compact's drafting. We were in the chamber. We heard every argument made for and against inclusion, and we remember who made them, and what was said, and what was agreed to in the sessions that were not recorded. If the Dominion would like us to recite those sessions, we are available." There was a very long pause from the Dominion's legal division. Ray got none of this in real time. He and Sorrel were in the processing core, and the electromagnetic interference that made bioscanners useless also made datapad reception unreliable. What reached them was fragments, partial signals, pieces of news broadcasts, a few lines of transmission text that Sorrel could hear through the station's frequency range in a way that Ray could not. Sorrel heard the old dragons. Sorrel went very still in the middle of a sentence, and then was quiet for so long that Ray said, "Sorrel?" "I know that voice," Sorrel said softly. "The one leading the transmission. I know that cadence. It is in the old records." A pause. She was a memory keeper. Before the Dominion's classification, she kept the histories of 4 civilizations simultaneously. Sorrel stopped. "She is very old. What is she saying?" Sorrel was quiet for another moment, listening to something Ray couldn't hear. "She is saying my name," Sorrel said. "She is saying I am a person." Ray sat next to Sorrel on the warm floor of the core and did not speak. Sorrel talked for hours after that, unprompted, in the way of someone who had been holding things for a very long time and had found, unexpectedly, the space to put them down. Old records. Dragon histories. Accounts of civilizations the Dominion had absorbed over centuries. Words spoken in founding chambers. Species that had lived and been reclassified and lost. All of it held in perfect, unbroken memory, exactly as it had been given. Ray listened to all of it. At one point he said, "If you were free, if you were really free, you could share all of this. With everyone." Sorrel looked at him. "That is what we were. Before. That is exactly what we were." Then, through the static and interference, a partial transmission reached the processing core's internal speakers, a station-wide update from Ness, clipped and calm. The two warships in the sector had altered course. They had not left, but they had slowed. Ray looked at Sorrel. Sorrel's scales moved through a color Ray had not seen before. Not gold, not green, something in between, deep and steady, like light through old leaves. "They slowed," Sorrel said, as if testing whether the words were real. "Yeah," Ray said. A silence. The processing units hummed around them. Then Sorrel said, in a voice that was quiet and very young and very tired, "I have been running for so long." Ray didn't answer that. There wasn't a good answer. He stayed where he was, on the warm floor, in the noise and the heat, while outside the station the galaxy turned slowly towards something no one had entirely planned. The legal process took 40 days. 40 days of Dominion ships holding position in the sector without acting, something that had never happened before in a retrieval operation, because retrieval operations did not pause for legal questions. The galaxy's infonet ran arguments in 40 languages. Dominion councils issued statements. The Terity legal scholars published 3 more careful documents. The old dragons said nothing further, but their transmission remained in the public record, and anyone could read it, and many people did. On Helix Station, life continued in the strange, suspended way of things that are waiting. And while they waited, something else happened. Word had continued to travel, not just the story of Sorrel, but Sorrel's own transmissions. Beginning in the second week, working with Deshi in the station's main comm array, Sorrel had started sending. Not arguments, not political statements. Records. Old dragon records, spoken aloud in Sorrel's own voice and broadcast on open frequency. Histories of civilizations long absorbed by the Dominion. Accounts of species that had been reclassified and forgotten. Words from founding chambers that official Dominion history had omitted. It was not a weapon. It was a library. A library that had been waiting inside one small, gold-green dragon for years, and was now, finally, being given to anyone who wanted to listen. The Terity called it the most significant archival discovery in 4 centuries. Several Dominion member councils called it a political crisis. Dominion legal teams called it inadmissible. The rest of the galaxy was already reading it and listening to it, and in some cases weeping over it, because history that was supposed to be gone turned out not to be gone at all, just held, quietly and carefully, in the memory of the ones who had been told they were only weapons. On the 38th day, Diplomat Farron requested that Sorrel be permitted to address the Dominion Legal Tribunal directly. Farron was a human diplomat who had spent 20 years working in Dominion politics with very few cards to play, learning the exact shape of a system that did not consider humans particularly important, and finding, over those 2 decades, every small opening the system had not thought to close. She was patient in the specific way of someone who had been waiting a long time for exactly this kind of moment. The tribunal agreed. Not easily, but they agreed. Sorrel spoke for 4 hours. Not in anger, not in accusation. In the careful, precise, total recall that was the oldest and truest thing dragons had ever been. Memory keepers, speaking the truth of what had happened, in the exact words and sounds and details of the moments themselves. Sorrel spoke about the harvesting ship, the restraints, the sound of older sparks in the cells nearby after the bonding procedure, the sound of silence where there had been a voice. Sorrel spoke about what dragons had been before the classification, what they had chosen to be, what had been taken from them and told to them as fact, that they were not persons, that they had never been persons, that the fire inside them was a resource, not a self. No one on the tribunal spoke. No one moved to interrupt. At the end, a Terity observer, an old one, with the particular stillness of a species that measured time in centuries, asked one question. When you chose to hide on the human station, Why that station? Why that person? Sorrel was quiet for a moment. I did not know Ray would help me, Sorrel said. I did not know any of this would follow. I hid there because I was very frightened and very small, and that station felt, somehow, quiet. Safe. A pause. But I whispered. I asked. And Ray said, we figure out the rest in the morning. Sorrel's scales shifted, slow and steady, to full gold. I had never been told that before, that there would be a morning to figure things out in. The tribunal ruling came 2 days later. It did not grant full legal personhood to all dragonkind. That fight would take years, and everyone in the room knew it. What it ruled was narrower. Sorrel, specifically, based on documented communication, cognition, and the testimony of the tribunal itself, could not be classified as property under existing Dominion law. Sorrel was to be released to free movement pending broader legal review. It was not everything. It was not close to everything. But it was a morning to figure things out in. The Dominion ships left the sector without ceremony. Solith was not seen on Helix Station again. Reth, who had filed his initial report stating no confirmed sighting, was listed as having been correct and accurate throughout, which was technically true. Ray and Sorrel stood at the observation port together and watched the last of the Dominion ships alter course and disappear into the dark. Ray said, so, what do you do now? Sorrel was quiet for a moment. There are other sparks. On those ships. On other ships. On stations I cannot reach from here. The gold scales were still. They will not be freed today. No, Ray said. But they know someone looked under the bed. Sorrel's voice was soft. That is not nothing. Ray smiled. No, it's not nothing. They stood there for a while. The stars were the same as always. The station hummed its ordinary hum. Then Sorrel said, without preamble, in the careful way of a creature choosing words that mattered. The old records speak of dragons who bonded willingly. Not through the Dominion procedure. Not forced. A choice, made freely, between a dragon and a person they trusted. A partnership. Ray glanced sideways. You are still a maintenance technician, Sorrel said. On a mid-tier orbital platform. You have no warship, no political rank, no ancient bloodline. All true. By every measure the Dominion uses, you are entirely unremarkable. Ray said, thanks, Sorrel. Sorrel looked at him. The amber eyes were steady. The scales were warm gold, the gold of something no longer running. By every measure that matters, Sorrel said. You are the most remarkable person I have encountered. Ray looked out at the stars for a long moment. Co-pilots, he said. Sorrel exhaled. A small, warm breath that smelled like struck flint and something sweeter, and carried just the faintest thread of gold flame, gone in an instant. Co-pilots, Sorrel said. 17 months later, Diplomat Farron tabled the first formal motion in Dominion history to re-examine the legal status of dragonkind. It failed. She tabled it again. On Helix Station, the maintenance log carried a recurring entry every week. Thermal anomaly, processing core, under investigation. It had been filed by the same technician for over a year. No follow-up had ever been conducted. No one had flagged it for review. No one intended to. Petra still left copper by the door sometimes, out of habit. Deshi had started learning the old dragon scripts that Sorrel was teaching, slowly, with great effort, and with Sorrel's absolute refusal to let him get any of the pronunciation wrong. Yolanda had written a paper for the Galactic Medical Archive on the long-term physical effects of pre-bonding restraint, under a careful pseudonym, with meticulous sourced notes. The galaxy was not fixed. The Dominion still classified most of what it chose to classify. The fight was long and the ground was hard, and the small things, the copper left outside a door, the list written in a maintenance bay, the word yes said at 2 in the morning to something frightened in the dark. The small things were still just small things. But they were also, as it turned out, the things that started everything else.